The moment someone hurts you, something inside you reacts before you even have time to think. Your chest tightens, your thoughts begin to race, and almost instantly, your mind starts building a response. You want to explain yourself. You want to correct them. You want to make them fully understand what they did and why it hurt. It feels natural. It feels justified. But hidden inside that moment is something far more important than the pain itself. Because the second your reaction becomes predictable, it becomes controllable. And that is where everything begins to change. Most people move straight toward the noise. They argue. They chase clarity. They demand closure. They try to prove their side, prove their value, prove that they should not have been treated that way. But what if real strength is not found in immediate expression, but in restraint? What if power is not about forcing someone else to see your worth, but about refusing to place your worth in their hands in the first place? That is where Stoicism enters, with a lesson that sounds simple, but feels incredibly difficult when the moment is real. You do not control what happens to you, but you do control how deeply it reaches you. And once you truly understand that, silence stops being empty. It becomes intentional. It becomes a form of control. Not avoidance. Not weakness. Not fear. Control. The kind that does not need to announce itself, because it can be felt in the way you choose not to react. Think about the last time someone hurt you. Not only what they said or did, but how you responded afterward. The event itself may have passed, but your reaction stayed. The replaying, the overthinking, the imaginary conversations you kept having in your head long after everything was over. That is usually what lingers the longest. Not just the wound, but how deeply it pulled you in. That urge to answer, to explain, to make them understand, to somehow restore balance. And in the moment, it feels automatic, like something takes over before you even have the chance to pause. It feels necessary. It feels urgent. But if you slow that moment down, even for a second, something important becomes clear. The urgency is not coming from wisdom. It is coming from emotion. And emotion in that state is loud, intense, and persuasive, but it is not always truthful. It tells you to act now. It tells you that silence means weakness. It tells you that if you do not respond immediately, you are losing. But the Stoics saw this very differently. They understood that your first reaction is rarely your wisest one. It is simply your fastest one. It rises from hurt, from ego, from the desperate desire to regain control. But reacting in that state does not restore your power. It gives your power away, because once someone can predict your reaction, they can influence it. Your response becomes part of a pattern, and patterns are easy to read. This is how people lose something important without even noticing. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Quietly. Subtly. Every reaction reveals something. It shows what unsettles you, what triggers you, what throws you off balance. And once those things become visible, they become usable. Not always in a deliberate or manipulative way, but the dynamic still changes. One side reacts, the other side observes. One side becomes emotional, the other becomes stable by default. And just like that, the balance is gone. The Stoics were never trying to remove emotion from human life. They understood emotion is natural. What they refused to do was be ruled by it. Because when emotion takes over, your awareness becomes narrow. Everything collapses into that one moment. You lose distance. You lose perspective. You lose intention. You stop choosing and start reacting. And that is the part most people miss. It is not only about what you say or what you do. It is about what is controlling you while you say it. That is why the shift matters so much. The shift is simple, but it is not easy. Instead of asking what happened and how do I make them understand, you ask a different question. What is actually in my control right now? And the answer is always the same. Your thoughts. Your interpretation. Your response. Not them. not their behavior, not their intentions. Just you. And strangely, that does not make you weaker. It grounds you. Because the moment you stop trying to control everything outside of yourself, you finally begin to gain control over what is within you. And that is where real stability begins. Not in changing other people, but in mastering how you respond to them. This is where real stability begins, not by changing other people, but by mastering how you respond to them. And that is why discipline matters, not the kind that suppresses your feelings or forces you into silence out of fear, but the kind that creates space. A small but powerful space between what you feel and what you choose to do next. Because inside that space something changes. You are no longer reacting automatically. You are choosing intentionally. And over time that single shift begins to transform everything. You become harder to provoke, not because you are distant or closed off, but because you are no longer predictable in the ways that weaken you. You stop feeding the same patterns that once controlled your behavior. Instead of reacting on impulse, you begin to move with clarity and purpose. And if you are someone who wants to think more clearly, react less impulsively, and carry yourself with more discipline and self-respect, then understand this: it is not just a habit, it is a decision. A decision to become someone who is grounded, steady, and not easily shaken. What starts to change next is subtle but incredibly powerful. You begin to realize that not every situation deserves a response. Not every comment requires your attention. Not every feeling needs to be expressed immediately. And that does not make you cold or disconnected. It makes you intentional. It means your actions are no longer controlled by emotion in the moment, but guided by conscious choice. And that is where real power exists. As this way of thinking deepens, your entire experience of life begins to shift. You are no longer trapped in the same loops of reaction. You stop replaying conversations over and over in your mind. You feel less pressure to prove yourself, to explain every detail, or to justify your position. Not because you do not care, but because you have understood something deeper. Your peace is not something to negotiate, it is something to protect. And protecting it begins with recognizing that your response is always within your control, no matter what is happening around you. So what actually happens when you pause? Instead of reacting immediately, you take a step back, not physically but internally. You allow a moment to pass without rushing to respond. And at first this feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because you are interrupting a pattern that may have been running for years. The urge to react does not disappear. The thoughts are still there. The emotions are still present. But you choose not to act on them right away. And in that small moment something begins to shift. The intensity that once felt overwhelming starts to loosen its grip. Not because the situation has changed, but because your relationship to it has changed. That space, even if it lasts only a few seconds, is where control begins to return. Not control over the situation, but control over yourself. And that difference changes everything. Because when you react instantly, you are not choosing your response, you are releasing it. You are letting whatever emotion rises to the surface take control of your behavior. But when you pause, you introduce awareness. You begin to see the reaction forming before it takes over. You notice the impulse instead of becoming the impulse. And the moment you can see it, you are no longer fully controlled by it. This is where silence takes on a completely different meaning. It is not emptiness. It is not avoidance. It is presence. A deliberate decision not to engage in the usual pattern. And that kind of silence carries weight. It communicates something without needing words. Because most people are used to noise. When conflict appears, raised voices, long explanations, repeated attempts to defend or justify. That is the pattern people expect. So when that pattern is broken, when you choose not to react in the way they anticipate, it creates something words cannot create. A pause. A shift. A kind of tension that invites reflection. And in that moment, without saying much at all, you begin to take back control, not just of the situation, but of yourself. This is the foundation of Stoicism Breath, not just understanding these ideas, but living them in real moments where it actually matters. What you begin to create in that moment is not conflict but uncertainty, and not the kind of tension that escalates, but the kind that makes people pause and think. Because uncertainty has a unique effect, it slows things down, it interrupts automatic reactions, and it invites reflection in a way that arguments rarely do. Most people misunderstand this completely. They assume that if you stay silent, you do not care. They assume that if you do not react, you are weak or indifferent. But in reality, it is often the opposite. It takes far more strength to remain composed than it does to react emotionally. Reacting is instant, it is instinctive, it requires no effort and no discipline. But choosing silence, especially in a moment where you feel completely justified to speak, requires something deeper. It requires restraint, it requires clarity, and most importantly, it requires you to value your internal state more than your immediate impulse. And that is not weakness, that is control in its most refined form. Think about this for a moment. When you decide not to explain yourself in the heat of the moment, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. You step out of the emotional exchange. You stop feeding the cycle. Because most interactions rely on participation, one person says something, the other responds, and the exchange continues. Back and forth, reaction after reaction, until the situation grows heavier than it needs to be. But when one side chooses to step out of that loop, the rhythm breaks. The pattern collapses. And suddenly the other person is left without the reaction they expected. They are left alone with their words, their tone, and their actions without immediate feedback to push against. And in that space something shifts. Reflection begins, not because you forced it, not because you argued your point better, but because you removed the usual structure that keeps the interaction alive. This is where many people get it wrong. They think silence means avoidance. They think stepping back means running away. But avoidance is driven by fear. Intentional silence is driven by strength. You are not escaping the situation, you are choosing not to engage with it in a way that disrupts your clarity. You are giving yourself time to process, to understand, and to decide if engagement is even necessary. And here is something most people never realize. The more space you allow, the less urgent things begin to feel. What once felt like something you had to respond to immediately begins to lose its weight. What once demanded your attention starts to feel optional. And that shift alone can change how you experience almost every interaction in your life. There is also a quiet shift in how people perceive you. Not because you are trying to change their opinion, but because your behavior no longer fits into the pattern they're used to. When you do not react the way they expect, they cannot easily categorize you. They cannot predict your next move. And that unpredictability is not chaotic, it is controlled. It comes from someone who is no longer acting on impulse, but choosing with awareness. Once that happens, the dynamic changes completely. It is no longer about pulling a reaction out of you. That door is closed. And when that door closes, the entire interaction has to adjust. People are used to noise and moments of tension, raised voices, long explanations, repeated attempts to defend or justify. But when that noise is replaced with presence and restraint, something different takes its place. A deeper awareness begins to form, not only in the interaction, but within you. You begin to listen more, not just to others, but to yourself. You start noticing your thoughts, your emotions, your impulses before they turn into actions. You allow them to settle instead of immediately acting on them. Because what you say in the heat of the moment usually reflects your reaction, not your intention, and those two are rarely aligned. As you continue practicing this, something else changes. You feel less pulled into situations that once consumed your energy. Not because you ignore them, but because they no longer control your attention in the same way. You are not as quick to engage, not as quick to respond, and not as quick to internalize everything that happens around you. And what begins to form is a different kind of distance. Not a cold or disconnected distance, but a grounded one. A steady space within you that allows you to remain calm even when everything around you is not. Over time, this becomes natural. The pause is no longer something you force. It becomes automatic. Silence no longer feels uncomfortable, it becomes a place of control. And in that space something powerful grows, a quiet confidence. You no longer feel the need to prove yourself in every situation. You no longer feel the urgency to be understood immediately. You become willing to let things unfold without forcing an outcome. And that willingness changes everything about how you move through conflict. This is the shift that Stoicism Breath is built on, not reacting less because you are holding back, but reacting less because you have learned to choose better. And from that place something subtle but powerful begins to emerge, a quiet kind of confidence. Not loud, not performative, not something you need to prove to anyone. It is the kind of confidence that shows up in how you carry yourself when nothing needs to be said. You no longer feel the same need to assert yourself in every situation. You no longer feel that urgency to be understood immediately. Instead, you allow things to unfold on their own without forcing an outcome. And that single shift changes everything about how you move through conflict. What once demanded your attention now becomes something you can simply observe. You are no longer pulled into it the same way. You are no longer consumed by it. And in that moment, you gain something far more valuable than being right or being heard. You gain control over how deeply anything affects you. And once you develop that control, it becomes one of the most powerful tools you will ever carry. Now imagine this clearly. Picture a situation you have experienced before. Someone says something that would normally trigger you. Maybe it feels dismissive. Maybe it sounds disrespectful. Maybe it touches something personal that used to set you off instantly. In the past, that moment would take over your mind, would start building responses before they even finish speaking. Your body would tense, your tone would shift, and the entire interaction would begin to follow a predictable path. But this time something is different. You do not rush. You do not match their energy. You stay composed, not distant, not cold, just steady. And in that steadiness something begins to change. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet way that carries real weight. The entire dynamic starts to shift. You acknowledge what needs to be acknowledged, nothing more, nothing less. There is no over-explaining, no emotional overflow, no attempt to make them fully understand you. You respond with clarity, with precision, and then you stop. You do not chase the conversation. You do not try to force closure from someone who may not even be capable of giving it. And that restraint, that simple decision to do less instead of more, changes the entire structure of the interaction. Because whether people realize it or not, most interactions run on patterns. Someone pushes, the other reacts, and from there everything escalates. It becomes mechanical, predictable, almost automatic. And because it is predictable, it becomes easy to control. But the moment you step out of that pattern, the structure breaks. There is no escalation because there is nothing feeding it. There is no back and forth because you are no longer participating in it the same way. And what is left is something most people are not prepared for, a kind of silence. Not the absence of words, but the absence of predictability. And that is where something interesting happens. Uncertainty enters the space, not confusion, not chaos, but a pause and expectation. They were expecting a certain version of you, a familiar reaction, something they could anticipate and respond to. But instead, they are met with something they cannot easily read, something measured, something controlled. And in that moment, the focus shifts. It is no longer about pulling you into the interaction. It becomes about understanding why you did not respond the way they expected. And that is where reflection begins. Not because you forced it, not because you explained yourself more clearly, but because you remove the pattern that usually keeps everything moving in the same direction. This is the power behind Stoicism Breath, not reacting less out of suppression, but stepping out of patterns that no longer serve you and choosing something stronger in their place. Most people are used to environments where everything runs on reaction. Someone speaks, and they expect a response. Someone acts, and they expect feedback. That is how the rhythm of interaction is built. Action and reaction, back and forth, like a loop that rarely stops. But what happens when that expected response never comes? Something unexpected appears, a gap. And in that gap something powerful begins to happen. The other person is left alone with their words, their tone, their behavior, without immediate reinforcement. They cannot push against you because there is nothing to push against. They cannot escalate because there is no energy feeding the escalation. And that space often creates more reflection than any argument ever could, because arguments keep both sides locked in position, each person trying to prove something, defend something, win something. But when there is no argument, there is no resistance. And when there is no resistance, the mind has nowhere to go but inward. That is where real impact begins. But to reach that point requires a quiet kind of discipline. Not the kind that suppresses what you feel or pretends nothing happened. You still feel everything. You are still aware of what was said and how it affected you. But instead of letting that feeling control your behavior, you allow something deeper to guide you. Your principles. You begin to ask yourself not what do I feel like doing right now, but who do I want to be in this moment? And that shift changes everything. Because now your response is no longer tied to emotion, it is tied to identity. It reflects who you are becoming, not what you are reacting to. And when you repeat that decision over time, something begins to build inside you, a kind of internal consistency. You start trusting yourself more because you know you are not easily pulled into reactions you will regret later. You know your actions come from clarity, not impulse. This does not mean everything suddenly becomes easy. There will still be moments where the urge to react feels strong, moments where staying composed requires effort. But the more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. The space between stimulus and response begins to grow. And in that space you find something most people never fully experience. Freedom. Freedom to choose how you respond instead of reacting automatically. Freedom to step back instead of being pulled in. Freedom to not engage in something that does not serve you. And that freedom changes everything about how you experience your interactions. You are no longer at the mercy of what others say or do. You are grounded in something much stronger, your own ability to choose. Because think about it clearly, the moment someone can control your reaction, they hold power over you. If they can predict how you will respond, they can influence your behavior without even trying. But the moment you break that pattern, the moment your response is no longer automatic, that influence weakens immediately. You are no longer reacting to them. You are acting from yourself. And that shift, even though it looks small on the surface, changes everything over time. Not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. You begin to recognize a version of yourself that is steady, grounded, not easily shaken, and not easily pulled into unnecessary conflict. You become someone who knows when to engage and when to step back. And that clarity removes a lot of the noise that usually fills your mind. You are not constantly replaying conversations wondering what you should have said or done differently, because you already know your response was intentional, not reactive. And there is a deeper layer to this that reveals itself as you continue. When you stop participating in predictable patterns, you stop reinforcing the same outcomes. You are no longer feeding cycles that keep repeating themselves, and that creates space. Space for different kinds of interactions. Space for respect instead of reaction. Space for clarity instead of confusion. It does not mean every situation improves, but it means you are no longer contributing to what keeps you stuck. And in that, something important settles inside you. A sense of stability. Not because everything around you is controlled, but because you are. Your response is no longer something others can easily predict or influence. It becomes something you choose. And when your actions come from that place, they carry a different kind of weight. Not loud, not aggressive, not forced, but steady. And that steadiness is often more powerful than any reaction could ever be. This is where many people misunderstand the idea completely. They think it is about confusing others, playing games, creating mixed signals, trying to appear unpredictable. But that is not what this is. Because anything that is forced, anything that is calculated only to manipulate, will eventually collapse. It has no foundation, no stability. Real power does not come from trying to control how others see you. It comes from no longer needing to control it at all. That is the shift behind Stoicism Breath, not becoming harder to understand, but becoming so grounded that understanding is no longer something you chase, it is something that naturally follows your presence. There is a common misunderstanding that if you want to shift how people treat you, you need to control how they see you. You need to say the right things, explain yourself better, adjust your tone, manage their perception. But the truth is much simpler and far more powerful than that. The real shift does not come from trying to control others. It comes from no longer reacting in predictable ways. Because think about it, most interactions are built on patterns. Someone pushes and you respond. Someone pulls away and you chase. Someone creates tension and you rush to fix it. These patterns feel natural because they have been repeated so many times. But natural does not always mean healthy. And the moment you step out of that pattern, everything changes. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet way that people can feel even if they cannot explain it. When your behavior is no longer driven by impulse, you become harder to read. Not because you are hiding anything, but because you are no longer operating on the same emotional script. You are no longer reacting automatically. You are choosing deliberately. And that kind of unpredictability is not chaos. It is control. It is what happens when your actions come from clarity instead of emotion. When you stop trying to be understood in every moment and start focusing on being aligned with yourself instead. At first, this creates distance. Not just physical distance, but psychological distance. The kind of distance where people can no longer access you in the same way they used to. They cannot trigger the same reactions. They cannot rely on the same patterns. And because of that, the entire dynamic begins to shift. Most people never realize how visible their patterns are. The way they react under pressure, the way they respond to certain words, the way they look for validation or reassurance. Over time, these behaviors become predictable. And anything predictable can be influenced. Not always intentionally, but the result is the same. You become part of a loop that others can navigate without much effort. They know how to get a reaction from you. They know how to pull you back into the same cycle again and again. So breaking that loop requires more than changing what you say. It requires changing how you respond internally. Instead of asking, how should I respond so they understand me, you begin to ask, what response aligns with who I am becoming? And that question changes everything. Because now your actions are no longer tied to their behavior. You are no longer reacting to them. You are acting from yourself. And that independence creates a different kind of separation. Not avoidance, not distance for the sake of protection, but clarity. You begin to understand what deserves your energy and what does not. You stop engaging in things that drain you without adding value. You stop chasing outcomes that were never yours to control. And over time, something interesting happens. You become harder to categorize. Not because you are inconsistent, but because you are no longer predictable in the ways people expect. Your responses are not based on habit. They are based on principle. And principles are not easy to manipulate. They are stable, consistent, and internally driven. This kind of presence does not need to be announced. It is felt. In the way you speak, in the way you pause, in the way you choose when to engage and when to step back. There is a quiet confidence in it. Not loud, not performative, but steady. And that steadiness naturally changes how others interact with you. Not because you are trying to control them, but because you are no longer participating in the same patterns. The old dynamic no longer works, so it has to adjust. This is exactly what Carl Jung pointed to when he said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Most reactions happen automatically before you even have time to think. They feel like who you are, but in reality, they are patterns you have repeated over time. But the moment you begin to notice them before acting on them, you interrupt the cycle. And in that interruption, something powerful appears. Choice. The ability to respond differently, not based on habit, but based on awareness. And as that awareness grows, you start moving through situations with a different kind of clarity. You see what is trying to pull you into a reaction, and instead of following it, you step back, not out of fear, but out of understanding. And that is the moment where everything begins to change, not because others see you differently, but because you are no longer the same person reacting in the same way. That is the shift. Stoicism Breath is built on not controlling the world but mastering the way you move within it. There is a moment that most people overlook a small, almost invisible interruption between what you feel and what you choose to do next, and inside that moment something powerful appears: choice, not the kind of choice that feels forced or artificial, but real choice, the kind that comes from awareness. And when you begin to notice that moment, everything starts to change. You start to see situations more clearly. You begin to recognize when something is pulling you into a reaction that does not actually serve you. Maybe it is a comment that feels disrespectful. Maybe it is silence that feels like rejection. Maybe it is a situation that triggers an old pattern, and instead of following that impulse, automatically you pause, you step back, not because you are afraid, not because you are avoiding, but because you understand what is happening. And that understanding creates distance. You begin to realize something simple but freeing: not every situation needs your participation, not every interaction deserves your energy, and that realization alone can change the way you move through life in a way most people never experience. Because from that point forward, you are no longer chasing the same things, you are no longer trying to be validated in every moment, no longer needing everyone to understand you or agree with you. Instead, your focus shifts inward. You start asking a different question: does this align with who I am becoming? And that question becomes your foundation. It becomes the standard that guides your decisions, what you engage with, what you walk away from, what you invest your energy into. And slowly something begins to settle inside you, a kind of stability, a sense of direction that does not depend on what other people say or do. You are no longer easily pulled into situations that once controlled you. You are no longer reacting in ways that can be predicted or manipulated. You are moving with intention, with clarity, with a quiet confidence that comes from within. And this is where everything begins to shift. Not because people suddenly understand you better, but because you no longer need them to define your response. But here is the part that can feel uncomfortable at first. This was never really about them. It may seem like it is their words, their actions, the way they treated you. It all feels like the center of the story. But if you look closely, what keeps that situation alive is not what they did, it is what you keep doing with it afterward. The replaying in your mind, the constant analyzing, the need to understand, the need to feel seen or acknowledged, that is where your energy goes. And wherever your energy goes, that is what grows. This is where the Stoic perspective becomes powerful, because it removes the focus from them entirely. It does not ask if they were right or wrong. It does not focus on whether they will change or apologize. It asks something much more direct. What are you going to do with what happened? And that question changes everything. Because as long as your focus stays on them, your energy stays tied to them. Even if they are no longer present, even if the situation has ended, you are still connected through thought, through emotion, through the need for resolution. And that connection is what keeps you stuck. That is why so many people feel trapped long after something is over, not because they cannot move forward, but because they are still investing energy into something that no longer deserves it. But the moment you begin to redirect that energy, something shifts. At first, it is subtle, almost unnoticeable. Instead of replaying the situation again and again, you begin to observe yourself. You start noticing your patterns, your reactions, your tendencies. You begin to see where you gave too much, where you ignored your own boundaries, where you allowed your peace to depend on someone else. Not to judge yourself, but to understand. Because understanding creates awareness, and awareness creates change. And that change is what Stoicism Breath is truly about: not controlling others, not controlling outcomes, but reclaiming your energy, your attention, and your ability to choose who you become regardless of what happens around you. There is a moment in your growth that feels almost invisible, but it changes everything, not because something dramatic happens, but because you are no longer the same person responding in the same way you did before. You did not just move on from what happened, you move beyond the version of yourself that would have stayed trapped in it. And when you begin to detach from the need to react, to prove, to be understood, something unexpected happens. At first, it does not feel like freedom. It feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, like something is missing. Because for so long your energy was tied to what others said, what they did, how they behaved. There was always something to respond to, something to fix, something to explain. But now there is space. Quiet space. And most people underestimate how difficult that space can feel in the beginning, not because it is negative, but because it is new. You are no longer reacting automatically. You are no longer chasing resolution in the same way. And without that constant urgency, it can feel strange. But if you stay in that space long enough, something begins to shift. You start to notice that the same things no longer affect you the way they used to, not because you have become cold or indifferent, but because you are no longer controlled by them. There is a difference between feeling something and being moved by it. Before, a situation would pull you in completely, your thoughts, your emotions, your focus would revolve around it. Now, you can see it without being consumed by it. You can acknowledge it without needing to act on it immediately. And that small difference changes everything. Because now control is no longer external. It is internal. This is where real freedom begins, not the kind that depends on everything going your way, but the kind that comes from knowing your state is not dependent on what happens around you. You no longer need people to understand you in order to feel valid. You no longer need situations to resolve in a certain way to feel at peace. You no longer need closure in the form you once believed you did. And that realization removes a kind of pressure that most people carry without even noticing, the pressure to fix everything, to control outcomes, to manage how others see you. But when that pressure fades, your interactions begin to change. You start seeing people more clearly, not through expectation, not through projection, but as there. You engage when it aligns with you, and you step back when it does not. You are no longer trying to force things to work. You allow them to reveal themselves. And interestingly, this shift often creates a response in others, not because you are trying to influence them, but because you are no longer giving them the same access to your reactions. They may not understand it at first. They may expect you to respond the way you used to, but when that pattern is consistently absent, something changes. Not because you explained it, but because your behavior no longer matches their expectations. And in that moment, a deeper realization begins, not just for them, but for you. You begin to see how much of your past behavior was driven by patterns that you never questioned, how often you reacted out of habit instead of intention. And once you see that clearly, you cannot go back. You begin to move differently, not because you are forcing yourself, but because awareness naturally changes your behavior. You start catching the impulse before it turns into action. You notice the reaction before it takes over, and in that small pause, something powerful happens. You regain control, not over the situation, but over yourself. And that kind of control is what creates true stability, not something rigid, not something forced, but something natural, something that cannot be easily shaken. As Epictetus suggested, peace begins when you stop worrying about what is beyond your control. And once you truly understand that distinction, a lot of the noise disappears. You stop investing energy into outcomes you cannot control. You stop trying to influence reactions that were never yours to manage. And in doing so, you free that energy. You bring it back to where it has always belonged, to yourself. And that is the shift. Stoicism Breath represents not escaping life, but learning how to stand within it with clarity, with control, and with a quiet strength that does not depend on anything outside of you. There comes a point in your life where something quietly but powerfully changes. You stop waiting for things to resolve before allowing yourself to feel at peace. You stop tying your inner state to what other people do or say, and instead you carry that peace with you. And when you reach that point, something becomes very clear. The situation that once felt like it had power over you no longer does. Not because it changed, but because you did. Your focus shifted, your energy moved, your perspective expanded. And in that shift, you did not just move on from what happened, you moved beyond the version of yourself that would have stayed stuck in it. Now ask yourself what really happens when you let go of the need to react, to prove, to be understood. At first, it does not feel like freedom. It feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, like something is missing. Because for so long your responses were tied to what others did, what they said, how they behaved. There was always something to respond to, something to fix, something to explain. But now there is space. Quiet space. And that space can feel strange in the beginning, not because it is wrong, but because it is new. You are no longer moving in reaction. You are no longer chasing closure in the same way. And without that constant urgency, it can feel like something is off. But if you stay with it, something begins to settle. You start noticing that the same things do not affect you like they used to, not because you stopped caring, but because you are no longer controlled by them. There is a powerful difference between feeling something and being moved by it. Before, a situation would pull you in completely. Your thoughts, your emotions, your attention would revolve around it. Now you can see it clearly without being consumed by it. You can acknowledge it without needing to act on it immediately. And that subtle shift changes everything, because now control is no longer outside of you. It is within you. This is where real freedom begins, not the kind of freedom that depends on everything going your way, but the kind that comes from knowing your state is not dependent on external outcomes. You do not need people to understand you to feel valid. You do not need situations to resolve perfectly to feel at peace. You do not need closure in the way you once believed you did. And that realization removes a hidden pressure, the pressure to control outcomes, to manage perceptions, to constantly adjust yourself based on what is happening around you. As that pressure fades, your interactions begin to change. You start seeing people more clearly, not through expectation, not through projection, but as they truly are. You engage when it aligns with you, and you step back when it does not. You stop trying to force everything to work. You allow things to reveal themselves. And interestingly, this kind of detachment creates a shift in others, not because you are trying to influence them, but because you are no longer giving them the same access to your reactions. They may not understand it at first. They may expect the same version of you to show up again, but when that pattern is consistently absent, something changes. Not because you explained it, but because your actions no longer match their expectations. And in that moment, a deeper realization begins, not just for them, but for you. You begin to see how much of your past behavior was driven by patterns that were never questioned, how often you reacted out of habit instead of intention. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You begin to move differently, not as an effort, but as a result of awareness. You start catching the impulse before it becomes action. You notice the reaction before it takes over, and in that small pause, something powerful happens. You regain control, not over everything around you, but over yourself. And that kind of control creates a stability that is not easily shaken, not forced, not rigid, but natural. As Epictetus reminds us, peace comes from letting go of what is outside your control. And once you truly understand that distinction, the noise begins to fade. You stop investing energy into outcomes you cannot dictate. You stop trying to manage reactions that were never yours to control. And in doing so, you free that energy. You bring it back to where it belongs, to yourself. And that is the shift Stoicism Breath invites you into, not escaping life, but learning how to stand within it with clarity, with intention, and with a quiet strength that does not depend on anything outside of you. As you continue on this path, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Your thoughts become clearer. Your mind is no longer crowded by every situation, every opinion, every reaction that once pulled you in. You are no longer scattered across things that were never yours to carry. You become centered. And from that place, your decisions start to change. They become more deliberate, more intentional, no longer driven by the need to prove something, no longer shaped by how others might respond. You are not trying to show your worth through explanations, through reactions, through constant effort directed outward. Because your worth is no longer something you are trying to convince others of. It becomes internal, stable, something that does not shift based on approval or rejection. And when that happens, your behavior naturally becomes more selective. You begin to engage only where it truly matters, and step back where it does not out of avoidance, but out of clarity. You are no longer pulled into every situation that appears in front of you. You choose. And that choice is no longer emotional. It is intentional. It reflects who you are becoming, not just how you feel in a moment. And that is where the real power lies. Because this shift is not loud, it does not demand attention. There are no dramatic declarations, no sudden changes that everyone can see. But its effect is undeniable. When someone expects access to your emotions and finds composure instead, when they expect a reaction and are met with calm presence, something changes. A distance appears, not because you are closing yourself off, but because you are no longer available in the same way. You are no longer participating in patterns that once defined your interactions. And without that participation, the dynamic itself begins to change. For some people, this will feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because they were used to a version of you that reacted, that explained, that adjusted to maintain the connection. But this is not about unsettling anyone. It is about no longer compromising your state just to maintain something that does not serve you. It is about understanding that your peace is not something to negotiate. It is something to protect. And once you truly understand that, your standards begin to shift. You become more aware of what you allow into your space, not just externally but internally as well. Over time, this awareness becomes natural. You do not have to remind yourself constantly. It simply becomes the way you move through the world. You no longer feel the same pull to react. You no longer feel the same need to explain. You become comfortable with being misunderstood, if that is the cost of staying aligned with yourself. And that comfort removes a pressure that most people never question, the pressure to constantly perform for understanding. Now you are not performing. You are simply acting in alignment. And as this deepens, something else becomes clear. You begin to value your energy differently. You stop investing it in conversations that lead nowhere, in situations that drain you, in dynamics that require you to shrink or overextend just to maintain balance. Instead, you redirect that energy into your discipline, your habits, your mindset, your future. And that shift compounds over time. Because what you build within yourself becomes stronger, more stable, more reliable than anything external ever could be. In the end, what you gain is not just distance from certain people or situations. You gain a deeper connection to yourself. A stability that is not easily shaken. And from that place, everything becomes clearer. You are no longer moving in response to what others do. You are moving in alignment with who you have become. Your decisions feel lighter, not because they matter less, but because they are no longer weighed down by the need for approval or validation. You trust your judgment. You rely less on external signals to tell you how to feel or what to do. And that changes everything. Situations that once overwhelmed you now feel manageable. Interactions that once consumed your attention no longer have the same effect. You still feel, you still care, but you are no longer controlled. There is a quiet confidence in that. Not loud, not performative, but steady. And that steadiness becomes your foundation. A level of freedom that most people never reach, not because it is impossible, but because it requires letting go of the need to control what was never truly yours to control. At some point, you realize something simple but profound. The real power was never in reacting. It was always in choosing not to. Not because you stopped feeling, but because you learned not to be ruled by what you feel. And when you reach that point where your peace is no longer negotiable, where your worth is no longer dependent on anyone else, you do not just move differently. You become untouchable in a way most people will never fully understand. This is the path Stoicism Breath invites you to walk, a path of clarity, of discipline, and of quiet strength that changes everything without needing to announce itself.